Hello everyone, this is Jan Daris, integration architect, engineer, whatever. And today you joined our second episode on how we are going to deploy a hybrid Boomi environment within Azure. You can check our first episode where you can see the design now on the screen, where we from our local machine deployed a Azure Container App instance with the Boomi container running on it, where we have our Azure storage account behind it connected by NFS, all within a nice VNet, within one subscription. And we deploy that by running the Bicep locally, and that was working. And this episode we focus on the automation part, where we are going to deploy that same Bicep file with that same information by Azure Devops, and we will do it for both our development and production environment, and it will be done fully automated. So let's get started. Okay, first things first, you can get all information from our first episode on Github. It is within this same repository, and for the second episode we will have this directory. First of all, we have our infra. So here we have our Bicep file, and our Bicep file contains quite some parameters, as you see, which will we use. And we need these parameters because for each environment we are going to have a separate value for certain parameters. I will explain this Bicep really shortly now. The first thing what we do is create a Azure resource group. The second thing which we will do is create our VNet with two subnets inside it. One subnet specifically for the container app and one subnet specifically for the storage account. We need the VNet layer on top of it because our NFS connection to the storage account from the container apps is not allowed over the public internet. And of course a VNet is more secure, so you should always use it. Here we have our storage account. In that storage account we have a file service and a share with NFS. We call it NFS Storage Boomi. You can call it whatever you want. And we are going to make sure that we have our managed identity enabled and that we set up our private endpoint with our subnet for our storage account. Next, we are going to configure our log analytics workspace and app insights. I don't focus too much on that one, it speaks for itself. And then we are going to build our managed environment, which will host our container app instance. And what is important, that we have our storage NFS also connected over here. So here we are connecting our storage account to the foundation of the container app instance. And last but not least, we are actually going to deploy our container app on the container app environment. And what is important here is that we actually get the Boomi container version from Docker. And for now we don't host it. In a future episode I want to split the container app deployment so we can also automatically update it every period of time. But for simplicity, we will do it now like this. We have certain parameters which are required by Boomi. For example, we need our installer token, we need our Boomi Atom name, we need our Atom local host ID, which is the same in this case as the Boomi Atom name. The name is also the same as the Boomi Atom name. And because we want to connect our Boomi Atom or molecule, whatever you are deploying, to an environment, we also provide our environment ID value. And for the rest, we connect our volume to the NFS storage, which we had over here. Where is it? Over here. So now our container app can connect to the storage account over NFS. And we inject our Boomi installer token. On the left side, you see that we have two parameter files. One for development and one for our production environment. What you will see is that we, for example, define our IP ranges over here, and we have the flexibility to change the naming of our resources, and that is that. And we got also a .azdo directory, and within that we have our pipelines, and for now we have one pipeline. And what you will see is that we have various triggers. So we will trigger our pipeline if the branch is main or if it's a feature branch. And because, of course for you it will be different, but because I just used one repository, I only trigger this pipeline if it's in the episode 2. Okay, so first things first, I will explain the pipeline, and after that I will show you how we can actually embed it into our Azure Devops environment. So what we use variable groups, and when we go to Azure Devops, we have our project over here, and in my blog project I have repositories, and one of those repositories is my blog, and as you see it is connected with each other. So what we can now do is we can see that same information over here. For example, we see that same pipeline, and what we see is that we use a environment group. So we set our variables here. We have a group named Boomi Dev. So when we go to our pipelines, we have our library over here, and as you see we have 2 variable groups. And what we do over here is we give our pipeline certain variables which can be sensitive, for example, or which we want to be able to configure outside of Git. And that's what we do over here. And we have the same for production. And when we go back to our pipeline, is that we can see for each stage, for each environment, we have a different stage. And for each stage, we inject those variable groups over here. Later, we need to set up our permissions to allow our pipeline to use these environments, but I also show you that you have to set up a service connection. And in this case, I set up a service connection for both development and production. And you can do that by pressing this button. You say Azure Resource Manager. And what we do in this case, we are going to use an app registration. You give it a name. In the meantime, it's loading, and you can select the subscription the service connection should have access to. You can also do it on management group or whatever. And if you want to do it better, I would recommend using a managed identity or a managed app registration or managed identity. You can define the rules a bit more specific than give it owner rights on a subscription. Okay, let's go back to our repository. So as I mentioned, we use the variable groups within the build stage. So first we build and then we deploy. What we also see over here. So we have our repository, and the first thing we are going to build our bicep. Once we built our bicep, so we created the JSON file to actually deploy it to Azure, we are going to save it temporarily as an Azure artifact. And with our CD, so our deploy step, what we do, we actually get that bicep template. We are going to inject our environment specific parameters, and we then deploy it based off the branch where the pipeline is triggered on. So within Azure DevOps, you see now we are in our main branch. So our main branch, if we look to the pipeline, it will go to production, and if it is not main, so condition not equal to source branch main, so if it's our feature branch, it will go to the development environment. That's how we control what stage is going to happen. So back to the drawing, our first step is to build the bicep. So our first stage is the build part, and what you see is that we call a file named build stage bicep yaml. And what we do is we use the Azure CLI to actually perform an AZ bicep build based on the template file which we give to this file. And what we do next is, for this artifact, we publish it to our Azure artifacts. So back to the pipeline, we call it bicep artifact. It's in this template directory, as you see down here in the infra. So infra, that's where the bicep is located. So after we have done that, our next step is to actually deploy everything. And as you see, we depend on the build step. And in this case, as I mentioned, the branch should not be main. And we use the development variable group. So I will now set up our pipeline. So we go to pipelines over here, we say create pipeline, we say Azure repos get, we select our repository, and we are going to select a existing YAML pipeline. As you see, we don't get any options over here. So when we go over here, we can actually copy relative path and post it there. We can continue, and now our Azure Devops pipeline is able to find the YAML file. So I don't run it, I save it for now. And what we do is we go to our variable groups. So first our Boomi Dev. We are going to give permissions to use the blog pipeline. And we go now to our other variable group, production, and we do the same thing. So now that pipeline is allowed to use the variable groups. And the next thing which we do is we can, of course, rename and move the pipeline. So let's just call it episode 2 pipeline. So we can recognize it a little bit better. And we are going to connect now the variable groups with the pipeline itself. So in more actions, you have triggers over here. And in the trigger part of the pipeline, we can actually connect our variable group. So we can say link variable group. We're going to do that both for dev as production. Now we have linked it, and we are going to save our changes made to the pipeline trigger of the DevOps pipeline. And the next thing I want to show you in our pipeline is our deploy step. So what we see, we first going to do development. We use that Boomi Dev variable group, and our stage is the release stage of the bicep. And what you see, what we do over here is that we are going to perform a bash script. And in that bash script, we are going to do the same thing as we did in the first episode locally. We are going to do that by the DevOps pipeline. And first, we are going to provide the name of our pipeline. We are going to provide our Azure location. Going back to the library. Oh, 1 second. Sometimes it can be a little bit buggy, so we have to refresh. You see that we have our Azure resource region over here. That's that one. We use the quotes like this and the $sign to reference our variable groups. And over here, what you see is that we inject our bicep parameter file. So that's that main parameters.dev.json or production. But besides that, we also provide some extra pipeline variables into our bicep template. And as you see, these are coming from our Boomi environment group. When you look to my repository, I also have my Postman APIs. So you can import that in Postman. And you can actually also perform this API call. You can get your environment IDs like this. For example, this development, that's production. But what you can also do, you can go to your Boomi Atom management and you can get those information over here. On the next episode, I will add to the pipeline a little bit more Boomi specific checks and implementations to have a full CICD street. But I didn't want to make this episode too long and too complex. So what you see here is that we have our Boomi environment ID. And I also need to get a installer token. So I'm now going to get it. Let's copy it. And we can actually inject it over here into our Boomi installer token. I save that. I get another token down here, and I will use that for my production environment. Again, next episode I will focus on actually automating this part. And that's that. So now we are able to deploy our pipeline. So we now check this release stage. And we call it Bicep deploy. We use the service connection which we just created in Azure Devops. So just a quick show is in our project settings, we have our service connections and we use this name. And in my example, I actually have it as an environment variable available. So I use that name over here so I can dynamically configure it for my pipeline. And the next thing we do is we actually connect our DevOps environment. As you see, I have a DevOps environment for development and one for production. So when we go to pipelines in Azure DevOps, we have environments over here and we have development and production. And I would really recommend to implement this because what we can do, for example, is we can add a approval and we can say that you actually have to approve before someone, for example, can deploy something to production. So in this case, I will add myself for the production step and I have to approve this pipeline in this case to approve to deploy to production. Development in this case is can just happen, but production we have to approve. And from height over, this is kinda it. Let's start running. So what we now did is we have our repository, we have our CI part, we have our artifacts implementation and our CD part. And the next thing we do is actually run the first pipeline. So we are going to trigger the pipeline not from the main branch but from the feature branch. So we will do the development deploy part, and after that succeeded we will make a pull request where we are going to trigger the pipeline to run for the production subscription. And after that we will check Boomi again to see if our Boomi Atom is now properly running, and I will show you quickly how it will be in the Azure environment. So in our Azure environment, as I mentioned, we have two subscriptions, development and production, and there is nothing yet. So when we go over here, you see we only have a network watch, a resource group, and everything should be there later. So back to our pipeline, I can go here and I can say I want to run my pipeline. And because I now do it manually, but what we can also do is we can trigger it by pushing certain changes to a certain branch. And in this case, I will trigger it manually on the feature branch. So now we start running it. What you see is that we first have our build step. We can actually press it and we can see the logs from Azure Devops, what this is trying to do. So first we are going to build, and after that we do the deploy step. And I will pause the video now till this is done, because it can take quite some time. Okay, our build step is just finished, as you see over here. And now what we see is that before we can actually deploy to development, we need to give the pipeline permission to actually access our development environment, as you see over here. And I really recommend you to implement an environment like this, because you can set those type of policies and have control over your deployment to certain environments. So in this case I will permit it, and now my pipeline is going to continue with the deployment step to development, and we'll pause the video for now. In the meantime, the pipeline finished, so our build process is done. It took 18 seconds. And our deployment of the Bicep release file took 1.5 minutes. As you see, we just deployed to development and not to production, and that was because of that branch trigger, which we configured in our pipeline to only run when it's in not the main branch. So we can go now to Azure, and over here we have our resource groups. And in our resource group, you see that we now have 2 more resource groups. And what we can see down here is that we have our resources successfully deployed. And one of those resources is our Boomi Demo Dev Container App. Let's go to that one. And what you see is that the status is running. It's on consumption SKU. And when we go back to our Boomi Atom, you see now that on the development, our Boomi Atom dev is actually running. So that's a really nice thing. And the next thing what I want to do is showcase you how we can actually trigger those pipelines from our local machine. And also how we actually are going to deploy the environment to production. So what we did now is, if the branch is not equal to main, we deploy this one. And what I will now show you is where we actually are going to deploy a feature branch, and we perform a pull request to our main branch, and that should trigger our deployment to production. But back to our local repository. The left button, you see that I am now currently in the feature branch. So let's, for example, remove that one, save it, and example of our trigger to dev. So we commit that one now, when we sync the changes, and then we are in the pipeline. So we can go to our repository right now, to our branches, and you see that it is now automatically in progress. I will cancel that one now, because of course we just did this by triggering it manually. Then we go back to our repo, we can see our branches over here. And now we are going to perform a pull request, where we are going to merge the test feature branch into main. So you can select pull request over here, and we select our feature branch, and we say we want to into our main branch. Merge to main, and I'm going to say that Jan from Intersky, that dude, he has to approve it. And when I approve it, I can complete the merge. So now we are going to merge, and I'm going to delete my original feature branch. And the idea behind that is that for every new feature or ticket or whatever, you create a feature branch, and in that way you can keep track of your changes, and your feature branch stays up to date of your main branch. So now we are merging, and as you see, we just completed our merge. So when we go back to our branches, you also see that this one is now in progress. So let's go to our pipeline. and it is now building. And I expect this to take about 20 seconds, so just wait for it, because what we said on our environment level is that for production, besides allowing it to be deployed from the pipeline, every time we also need to say this is approved by, in this case, me. And in a real life scenario, you would of course always have to say that you use a Entra ID group for that. So just as expected, we go to our production, and we need to allow our pipeline to use the production. So we're going to permit it. And now our deploy step should go to production. So what you see is actually that we skipped the development part, because that's already what we did when we released our feature bench. And now, because we are going to production, we also actually have to approve each time we are going to deploy to production. Approved. And now it's going to continue, and see you soon. Okay, after about 1.5 minutes, my production pipeline is also done. As you see down here, we just did the build and the deploy to production, and we skipped the development part, just like we wanted. So let's go to Azure. What you actually see over here is that we have our production subscription, we have our resource group, and we also have our resource group for the demo. And as you see here, we also have a container app deployed for our production environment. Let's dive into it. This one is also running, it's enabled. We have our Boomi container with our environment variables over here, just like we set up in our Bicep. And when we go to Boomi, we see now that we have a Atom also installed for our production environment. So to summarize everything, what we did in this episode is actually deploy a development environment, a production environment, all from our centralized Azure Devops environment. And we made sure that whenever we have updates in the future, we can quite easily inject those changes into our environment. Thank you very much for the watch. Like and subscribe, and have a good day. Bye.